Well, good evening, friends. It's a real joy to welcome the Reverend Dr. Russ Levenson to St. Michael's tonight. Russ served for 17 years as rector of St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston, which is the largest Episcopal parish in North America, and he recently retired after just a remarkable tenure of leadership there. He's got a Master of Divinity from Virginia Theological Seminary, which is where I went. It's a wonderful place. A doctorate of ministry. Russ was also longtime pastor to President George H.W. Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush, who were devoted members of his parish. And in 2018, he officiated and preached at both of their funerals, and he published a very well-read book about them both called Witness to Dignity, The Life and Faith of George H.W. and Barbara Bush. And tonight, we get to hear about a new book he has written called Witness to Faith. Now, before I invite Russ up, I want to share something personal. Before I came to St. Michael's, I worked on diocesan staff for 7 years, and that role gave me the privilege of preaching and teaching throughout the diocese. And on a few occasions, I was invited to St. Martin's to maybe, preach at their contemporary service, or to teach a formation hour, or maybe speak at a men's prayer breakfast event. And more than once, a few weeks later, I would receive in the mail the St. Martin's Parish magazine with a handwritten little note from Russ that said something like, "Dear John, look on page 27. Thank you so much for being with us. We're grateful for your ministry." Now think about that. He was leading a parish of thousands. He's carrying enormous responsibility, and yet he took the time more than once to send me a handwritten note just to make sure that I felt appreciated and received his gratitude. I think that tells you something about who you're going to hear from tonight, something about his character, not just about his leadership, but about his care, his attentiveness, and his dignity in relationships. And that's why it's such a gift to have Russ with us tonight. So please join me in warmly welcoming the Reverend Dr. Russ Levenson to St. Michael's.
Well, thank you. I want to say a couple of things. First, I'm delighted to be here. I've worshiped with you before, and once you decide to step down from full-time ordained ministry, which is what I've done, although you're never not out of ministry, really, you can dress like that. And that's the way I dress now on Sunday. And I sit in the back like everybody else, and I gripe about the length of the sermon, and my wife elbows me and says, "Don't sing that loud," and I'm just like everybody else. But I put on my collar to be with you tonight, and the last time we worshiped with you, we sat right back here and had a great experience, as we have tonight. I mean, your trio of musicians here sounds like a 30-member choir. The lessons tonight were read with clarity and really real heartfelt passion, and I always love receiving the Eucharist wherever that happens. I am on what I've called the Texas three-step of the last few days. I've been in Houston, I was in Dallas yesterday, Good Shepherd this morning, and delighted to finish this little part with you. I'll be at the seminary tomorrow. So a little bit of work I'm still doing. I love the Diocese of Texas. I wore my Texas socks tonight, just so people know. I remain canonically resident. Even though I've moved to Alabama, I've remained canonically resident in Texas. I have tremendous respect for Andy Doyle and the work that's being done here. But also, I just want to say to you, places like St. Michael's, like Good Shepherd, where I was this morning, like St. Michael's and All Angels in Dallas. But I've been on a little book tour this fall. I am so encouraged by what I'm seeing in the Episcopal Church. I mean, to sit in a church that has experienced, as John just told me, 18% growth in the last year. So whatever you read in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times that the church has done, it's not. It's really coming to life in lots of places. And I kind of feel like Johnny Cash. I've been everywhere, man, this fall. And almost, not everywhere, but almost everywhere I went, I thought, no, I mean, God's doing great things in the church. And he's certainly doing that here in this great church on this beautiful, beautiful hill. And just a moment of personal privilege. Thank you for that sweet introduction, John. But I can say this now that I'm not doing this week after week. from my own pulpit where I've been assigned, and that is, I think one of the most important things you can do for the clergy who serves you here, John and his team, is to pray for them, part of the job is putting a good face on most of the time, trying to do our job with the Spirit of the Lord and joy of the Lord most of the time. And I will say, and I can say this now, if I'd said it before, it would sound self-serving. This is heavy work. It's heavy work. And I did this for over 30 years as an ordained priest. It didn't strike me until about 5 years before my retirement, and it started to hit me mostly in funerals. And I would come into a funeral, and I've done lots of funerals, as people in business have, and I would felt like an extra weight, for lack of a better term. I didn't know, and it took me a while and some spiritual direction to kind of put my finger on the fact that every funeral I began to do, I wasn't just walking in with one person. I seemed to be walking in with all the people I had ever buried. And I had to kind of begin to get my head around that. And the way in which I drew strength to continue to do that work was to know that the parishioners that I got the pleasure of serving alongside were praying for me. So we all know John Newton's perfect and never makes mistakes, and all your clergy are the same way. But however you feel about your team, pray for them and be there for them, because in many ways we're just like you, but we do carry things that you don't see. So, and I can say that now because I don't carry as many things as I did only a year ago. Let me pray, and then we'll begin. I want to talk about these books with you for just a bit. Almighty God, by whose spoken word all things came into being, speak to us now through this time together, that we may know more fully, more deeply, the passion of your love for us, known in Jesus Christ, and in receiving that good news, that we might be inspired to go and share the good news with all those you send our way in this world that so desperately needs to know your love and your care. Amen. So, we got two of my books are here with you tonight. John and I were just talking about this. So you know they are for sale. But so you also know people who write books like John and myself, unless your name is James Patterson or Max Lucado, you don't make a lot of money on these books. So the publisher makes money, Books A Million makes money, Amazon makes money. And I got my royalty check the other day for last year, and my wife went, "Is this for the year?" And the more important goal, I think, for those of us who write in the faith business is helping to spread the good news in different kinds of ways. So this book that I'm going to talk about tonight will be available for you across the way, and your team here has kindly pulled those together, Christine and others. And then this is a Lenten devotional that I wrote a few years ago, and you'd have to back up a few days. It actually begins on Ash Wednesday, and it's a daily reader, carries you through Easter Sunday. Let me say a word about why I wrote this book, Witness to Belief, which we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. John mentioned a moment ago the book I wrote on President and Mrs. Bush, who were wonderful, faithful members of St. Martin's Episcopal, and I knew them for the last 11 and a half years of their lives. And I never thought I would write a book about them. I was never taking notes on our relationship. I didn't. Fortunately, at least for now, my memory still works pretty good, and had lots of good memories. But I did, as John said, I was with both of them when they died. I was officiated and helped plan their services, and which were all dignified and Episcopal. You know, they were, if you watch those services, they were pretty much like, other than who attended, they were pretty much standard Episcopal services. And that was 2018. We got to 2019. We got to 2020. And I began to look at I'm not making political statements, so please write your letters to John. But I began to look at kind of what I would call the decline of dignity in the public square that was being offered by perhaps both parties and everything in between, and just this slide of disrespect that people had for one another. And it troubled me because knowing and being with George, and I say Mr. President and Barbara, the first time I ever talked to them on my own, I called her Mrs. Bush. And she said, you can call my mother-in-law Mrs. Bush. I'm Bar or Barbara, but not Mrs. Bush. And I often say, and he never said, don't call me Mr. President. So, we kept it at that. But I never heard them say a nasty word about anybody. And can you imagine, can we go back to a day like that. I don't know. I hope we can. I pray for that. I have told this story before, and it's not in the book on the bushes because I think it sets the stage for kind of the ache I was feeling. And fortunately in Texas, we have lots of people we know in government and leadership who've been positive role models. And James Baker is one of those. And Secretary Baker's in this book that I'm going to talk about. But there's this story he told, and you hear stories and you want to go, is that a preacher's tale or was that true? And so I had heard this story, and I kind of I said, Secretary Baker, is this true? Is this a real story, or is this lore? And he said, no, it's true. So the story is, and some of you may know the story, but right after President Reagan was shot, and for some of you, President Reagan was once our president. You may be young, it may seem like ancient history, but after the assassination attempt, and after he'd been operated on, and after he had visited with family, he was alone in his room. There was one aide sitting in the room with him. It wasn't a Secret Service guy. It was just a White House aide that was in the room with him. And so his first visitor, other than family, was the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who was a vehement political opponent. But Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, on the other side of the aisle, came in the room, acknowledged the aide, came over, took the president's hand, knelt down, prayed, recited the 23rd Psalm, stood up, kissed the president on the forehead, and said, I'm going to let you rest now. And I think, where have those days gone? And so, in the midst of all kind of that, I thought, I'm going to write a book about the Bushes, because what I observed was dignity, character, selflessness, gentleness. You never heard expletives from their mouths. And I was with them, particularly him, a lot of times when he was going through some painful medical procedures. I mean, I was with them at the times of their deaths. And, his last words were, I love you. Her last word was home. I mean, that's the kind of, and they wanted to be surrounded with us praying and saying those words we say at the time of death. And so we talked a lot about heaven, all those kinds of things. So that came together in the book that John mentioned. Well, what happened after that is I began to get letters, cards, notes from around the country from people saying, I'm glad to know they were the people I thought they were, or I'm glad to know people who had power, fame, wealth, influence, still valued prayer and reading the Bible and talking about their faith and having conversations with their priest. I mean, and I had one person say, well, if they can go to church every week, I can go to church every week. I mean, they went to church every week, and if they couldn't, I took it to them as we do. I'm glad. One fellow wrote me, I've been thinking about going to seminary for years, and I'm reading about their faith, and it was their story, and I'm enrolled in the Lutheran seminary this fall, those kinds of things. So I was touched. I mean, that was kind of the hope, was that their story would inspire, lift other people. Well, I kind of hoped and prayed things would get better in our world, and 22, 23, 24, and I start thinking, well, if that book can have that kind of impact, maybe another book about people who have fame, wealth, power, influence, the things that the world thinks is so valuable. Maybe that story could touch lives of others and inspire others. And so that's where the genesis of this book came together. So, I would say, and I'm sure John can attest to this, if I rarely wear my collar anymore, frankly. This is a new one. I had to get it off Amazon. I can't get it. But that's true. You can get them on Amazon. They're cheaper than Whipple and Almond. If we walk into the grocery, if we walk into your grocery here, as my experience was in Houston, like one of two things happens. Either people come up and they want to just unfold their religious life in front of you, or they want to look and see how much wine you've bought in your cart, or they want to, or they run the other way. They fully expect at some point, which often happen, where do you go to church, and come join us. They fully expect that from us. If a doctor, a homemaker, an architect, a teacher, a lawyer talks in that way, people listen. And if it can make a difference in that person's life, maybe it will make a difference in my life. I know you guys are paid to do this. But when I hear about lives that were changed who don't do this for a living, it makes a difference. So let me give you just a couple of examples. I think I call these kind of compasses, but I'm going to start with this. Let's see, Christine. Oh, there, hang on. Don't worry if it... There it goes. So this is Billy Graham, and whatever you think about Billy Graham, I love this story because he used to tell it on himself. And he did have a sense of humor. And he evidently told this at one of his crusades, and he said, I was going into a small town, to give one of my crusades, and I was going to post a letter. And sometimes I tell people, if they're much younger than 50, I'll go, so a letter is something you used to write, and you would fold it up, put an envelope, and put a stamp on it. And but this is back in the day, and Billy Graham said he had written a letter, he wanted to mail it to a friend, and he drove around this little town, and he couldn't find a post box. And so he saw this kid on a bike, and he pulls over, rolls down his window. By the way, we used to roll down our windows. And he rolls down his window, and he says, hey, young man, I'm looking for a post office, somewhere to mail this letter. Do you know where? And the little kid looks at him, kind of on his bike. He says, well, sir, if you go down here, take a right, go into town, in the middle of the square, there's a post office there, and I'm sure they'll mail that letter for you. And Billy Graham goes, oh, that's great. Thank you for telling me that. So I tell you what, tonight I'm having a big meeting just outside of town. I'd love for you to come. Would you come? I'm going to tell people, I'm going to tell you how you can get to heaven. And the little boy looked at him and said, I don't think so, sir. You can't even find the post office. And he used to tell that on himself, which I think is great. And then I can't verify this one. I like to verify my stories, but that Albert Einstein used to tell this story on himself. And he was kind of truly an absent-minded, brilliant professor. And he was on a train in the Northeast, and he was taking the train, the ticket taker starts to come through, and he stops in front of Einstein. And Einstein starts doing this, and he can't find his ticket. And the guy says, well, Dr. Einstein, we know who you are, so don't worry about it. Walks on, comes back a few moments later, finds Einstein on the floor, looking under his seat, poking around, and again, he says, sir, we know who you are. Don't worry about it. And Einstein evidently said, young man, I know who I am too. I can't remember where I'm going. And but I use those two humorous stories, which are supposedly true. I know the first one's true. At least he told it as if it was true. To say those kind of point the way. I do think we have a lot of people in our world today who don't know where they're going, who are lost, to use Jesus' words, and are looking for meaning and purpose. And I think one of my concerns, and I'm beginning to sound like the old guy that I don't necessarily want to be, but I am, is that a lot of what we get, of course, now is out of something we hold in our hands. And a lot of us are disconnected from the world because we're in this world. And there's a lot of not truth that's coming through this world. And particularly, as you know, for our young people, when you spend all your time on TikTok and social media and what you hear is you need to be an influencer, what you hear is the most important thing is to be famous or successful or wealthy. That can get in here. And then we need to remember Jesus' words. What does it forfeit a person to gain the whole world? A person to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul. And I think we have some soul tending to do. Let me give you a couple of examples, and I didn't know until this morning. I said this at Good Shepherd. I won't necessarily recommend his movies, but Judd Apatow was a comedian, very successful Hollywood producer of some pretty raunchy comedies. So I'm not going to quote any of the comedies. However, he's getting closer to middle age. And in an interview not too long ago, he said this. His interviewer said, "You have said as an entertainer, all the success in the world won't heal you." And Apatow said, "It doesn't do anything. There's a great distraction in thinking when I get to the top of that hill, it's going to be awesome. And then when you get to the top of that hill, you're like, oh, okay, I guess I now have to really deal with my problems because that didn't work at all." Now, somebody told me this morning, I haven't heard this, John, maybe you've heard, that he's now had some kind of religious experience. And that's tonight's research, but I heard that this morning. In the same year of that interview, Jim Carrey, who we know, and this doesn't look like Jim Carrey now, he's got a big bushy beard now, I think, but and he's kind of stepped away from the world's stage, but in 2000, right shortly after this interview with Apatow, I believe, and I did go watch this to make sure it was true, but he was a presenter at the Golden Globe Awards. And the Golden Globe announcer, as they do, said, announcing Jim Carrey. And now two-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey, and he comes out and everybody applauds, and he gets up to the microphone, and this is exactly what he said, because I saw it and then I typed it down. I am two-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey, and you know, when I go to sleep at night, I'm not just a guy going to sleep. I'm two-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey, going to get some well-needed shut-eye. And when I dream, I don't just dream any old dream. No, sir, I dream about being three-time Golden Globe winning actor Jim Carrey. And if you watch the clip, the camera's kind of out over this audience of tuxedos and evening gowns, and then he says this, and the nervous laughter after he says all of that, and then he ends with this, he goes, I don't dream any old dream, three-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey, because then I would be enough. It would finally be true, and I could stop this terrible search for what I know ultimately won't fulfill me. Pretty powerful stuff. Dave Letterman, who also now has a big bushy beard, by the way, but he said in a recent interview, after 3 decades as host of his own show, you believe that what you're doing is of great importance, it's affecting mankind wall to wall, and then you get out of it and you realize, oh, well, it wasn't true at all. Just silliness. And when that occurred to me, I felt so much better. I don't think I cared that much about television anymore. I feel foolish for having been misguided by my ego for so many years. I loved the film Bohemian Rhapsody. I can't believe it's almost been 10 years, but not quite 10, but 2018, about Freddie Mercury. I'm a big fan of Queen. I love the music. When the movie was over, I wanted to get up. My wife and I don't know if you watched it, my wife and I wanted to get up and dance. It's a great movie about his meteoric rise to fame and power and all the things that come with that life. But, a lot of times you watch a film and you get to the end of the film and, credits, it's too long, they can't go on to finish the story, so this is a major battle, and it said, there'll be these things that go, and this battle helped win the war, or he finished this business deal, and it actually led to his incredible success. And I wonder if after that movie, I've often wondered, would they have had the courage to put at the end something that he said in a BBC interview just shortly before his death, which was this: you can have everything in the world and still be the loneliest man, and that is the most bitter type of loneliness. Success has brought me world idolization, millions of pounds, but it's prevented me from having the one thing we all need, a loving, ongoing relationship. Douglas Copeland coined the phrase Gen X, Generation X, and he wrote a novel by the same name. And he writes fiction and nonfiction. He's a kind of a cultural student. And he grew up secular, but this is one of the things he came to terms with and spoke through one of his characters named Scout in one of his books. And this is what he said. He said, here is my secret. And I tell it to you with an openness of heart that I doubt I shall ever achieve again. So I pray that you're in a quiet room as you hear these words. My secret is that I need God. That I'm sick and no longer can make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem to be capable of giving, to help me be kind as I seem no longer capable of kindness, to help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. I need God. And then Bono's made no secret of his faith, lead singer of U2, and something he said a few years ago is, I think a defining question for a Christian is, who is Christ? And I don't think you're let off easy by saying a great thinker or a great philosopher, because he actually went around saying he was the Messiah. That's why he was crucified. He was crucified because he said he was the Son of God. So either he is, in my view, the Son of God, or he was nuts. And he goes on to say, and I find it hard to accept, a whole millions and millions of lives, half the earth for 2,000 years have been touched, have felt their lives touched and inspired by some nutter. Again, all these are compasses. And so where do we go? Well, I love the words of Abraham Lincoln, in which he had the wisdom and humility to admit, I have been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for the day. So when everything ran out, he turned to God. One of my favorite scenes in all of the Bible story, well, I guess we all have our favorites, is the Ascension. And actually, one of my rectorships was the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I used to like to remind the people of Ascension that in the story of the Ascension, of course, you have Jesus gathered with the remaining followers, maybe extras who had come along since the crucifixion. We don't really know. And then he basically says, okay, you know everything, and now I'm sending you as witnesses into the world. You got the stuff, go. And then what happens? He ascends. And then, I wish there was a video, because you could see all of them going, well, he'll be back in just a few minutes, because he always does that. And then, two angels supposedly show up and say, men of Galilee, what are you doing? Go. And I'm going to say that to you. What we're hearing in the messages of these people that didn't make the book, but they're people who have all the stuff, is that they found meaning, purpose in life in a loving, ongoing relationship with God in Christ. And that's what sustains them. And the world right outside these doors, I'm going to skip because I had a Bible verse. That's your world. That's a pretty big mission field. And there's a lot of people down there who have no clue about the kind of things we're talking about here tonight. And they need to, because they're being told what matters most is the stuff they get on their phone, or they see on television, or they saw their parents do. And all that stuff goes away. How do I know that? Because I'm getting older and I'm figuring it out, for one thing. But the other is I did spend the last year or so talking with these 12 people, and you'll be happy to know I'm not going to talk about all 12. I'm just going to skim across the surface. But as I began to think about that other book, and I knew some of these people personally, and some of them I didn't know. So I'm a pretty good stalker, and so I stalked a few, and they finally said yes. Stalked a few and probably scared them. But and I ended with these 12 and had interviews and conversations with these 12, most of whom I think you know: Denzel Washington, Nikki Haley, actor Sam Waterston, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Head of the NIH and the Human Genome Project, Dr. Francis Collins, who I commend his work to you. Singer-songwriter Amy Grant, commentator Britt Hume, Episcopalian. Gary Sinise, Jim Nance, our Texan and sports commentator. Episcopalian James Baker, and great Austinite William McRaven. And I will tell you, even though I did this for ordained part for over 30 years and lay part a little bit more, I walked away from all of these conversations a changed man. I really felt like I had, John, you'll know this when it comes. I left St. Martin smiling, which is the way you want to leave. I was like, okay, I'm happy. It's time for somebody else to come do this. You don't want to be going, when they're going, is he going to tell that story again? Or when is he going to go? So I just, it just kind of comes to you. And, but, you can also begin to think, I've done it all. I've prayed, I've fasted, I've gone on retreats, I've had spiritual, no. I had 12 spiritual directors right here, all of whom I walked away going, oh, I need to think more. I need to be open to growing more. I still have things to learn. I still have direction to go. So just quickly skimming across, I won't talk about all of them, but skimming across the surface of some of what I learned from these good people. And they're very different. The youngest was 53, Nikki Haley. The eldest was Jim Baker, who's now 96. And by the way, he's doing pretty well for 96. And I saw him the other night. Denzel Washington was one of the first to say yes, which was thrilling, but it took almost a year to get together. And it was back and forth on the phone, and we got to his office. I was a little starstruck. That probably was the one that made me the most starstruck. But sweet guy, humble guy. We met in Los Angeles, at his office in Los Angeles, And I was kind of trying to get my head around that. It finally worked out. And we came in the room, closed the door. It was just the two of us. And I'm getting out my writer stuff a little pad and a recorder and kind of setting everything up. And I had been calling him Mr. Washington up to that point. And he came in. I said, well, Mr. Washington, this finally has worked out. And he goes, come on, man, Denzel. And I was like, okay, Denzel. And he goes, give me a hug, man. And I can give him a hug. And we sat down. I'm still kind of swimming with wow. And I'm ready to go. And he goes, now, shouldn't we pray first? And I was like, yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we start that way? And but at some point in our conversation, he said, I don't need Oscars. I don't need money. I don't need movies. At this point in my life, he's 70 now. He said, all I want is more of God in my life. And I could go on and on about, we had subsequent conversations on the phone, and just a sweet, wonderful guy. Sam Waterston is somebody I've known for years. If you watch Law and Order, which I confess I'm a crime junkie. I have a novel coming out this summer called The Seal. It's really dark, and you can't talk about it from the pulpit, but it's pretty dark and scary. There's a serial killer and a priest, and I get kind of caught in that world. And I love that Law and Order is one of the few places in my life where everything gets done in an hour, and there's some completion. So he actually came and spoke at St. Martin's years ago through my stalking and what's now a friendship. And it was funny. You'll appreciate this, Episcopalians, and so we're in the sacristy with the acolytes, and we're getting ready to go out. It was at Advent lessons and carols, so he was going to do the lessons. And the acolytes are there, and they're kind of starstruck, and I'm kind of but Sam is very quiet, humble, and an Episcopalian. And I said, okay, acolytes, be on your best behavior tonight, because if not, this guy can have you arrested, tried, convicted, put in jail in an hour. And Sam, without missing a beat, just goes, 43 minutes with commercials. And it was... So... Laura and I have known Sam for years, and when we started, I said, I'd love for you to be part of this book. Of course, I'll do that. He said, why don't you come up and stay with us? And he and his wife live in this very, I will say, for a successful actor, very humble home up in New England and a goat farm. And he said, why don't you just come stay with us for a couple of days? So he and I had a lot of talks over those 2 days. And I asked everybody different questions. Some people asked the same question. And I asked Sam, I said, so, by the way, he's a great student of the Bible. He is a brilliant man. As John knows, publishers are kind of wonky about footnotes. If you're going to quote somebody, they want to know where it came from. And so Sam's just like throwing out quotes like this. But my publisher said, well, he can do that, but you have to find out where it came from. Original source stuff, not Google. And so if you look in his chapter, more footnotes in Sam's chapter than anybody's. But I said, well, what do you do to feed your spiritual life? He said, well, one thing I do is I meditate every morning for an hour. And I was like, oh, well, you're already ahead of me there. And we talked a little bit. I said, do you say anything? He said, no, I just sit quietly before God. And I said, well, I know you go to church, and he does. He goes to a very small church up in New England. He doesn't want me to tell what church he goes to. And I said, he reads his Bible. And I said, anything else? He said, yeah. Every evening, I meditate for an hour. And I said, so wait, an hour in the morning, hour in the evening. Do you say nothing in the morning? Do you say anything in the evening? He said, well, one thing. It's kind of a mantra. I say Maranatha, which in Aramaic means, come, Lord. So I said, so you just sit there for an hour and just say, come, Lord? He said, yeah. That became my Lenten discipline last year. I said, I'm not going to give anything up this year. I'm just going to try to say, come, Lord, more. And hopefully he'll show up. Condi Rice, Secretary Rice, I didn't call her Condi, Secretary Rice, very humble, sweet, not about politics. She's now the executive director of the Hoover Institute at Stanford, brilliant woman, very devoted Christian. Presbyterian, I believe, now. Grew up, Presbyterian. And her father was a pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, where I grew up, not far from the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I said, we had talked about lots of things, how God had guided her into some of the positions that she had, including this one. And I said, well, what do you do to strengthen do you share something about your prayer life? And she said, I pray every day. And she said, I have a pretty busy job here. She didn't say I'm the executive director of the Hoover Institute. She said, so in the morning it's short. I'll say, Lord, use me today, or guide me to someone who might need what I can offer, She said, but in the evening I pray this. And she began this litany of all these things that she prayed for, kind of like what we just did a minute ago, but really full. And she always begins her prayers by thanking God for her deceased parents, that they gave her life. And I was struck by that. And so I said, can I put, you can say no, but what's your posture when you pray? Do you mind? And she said, I always kneel. And she said, it's interesting you asked that, because I was just talking to my pastor the other day about this. And she said, I was in Washington and I had a pretty busy job. That's all she said. I said, yeah, I would imagine. And she said, and we worked long hours, 14, sometimes 16, 18 hours a day. And I would come home and I'd, put my purse down and I'd have dinner and get ready for bed. I'd kneel. And often I would kneel and I'd fall asleep while I was praying. And I didn't want to fall asleep. I wanted to say my prayers. So I changed it so that the first thing I did when I got home every night, before I did anything else, I would go in and kneel and say my prayers. And that's what I do to this day. So think about the executive director of the Stanford Institute coming home at the end of a long day, putting her purse down, going in the other room, and kneeling down, and then getting on with her evening. I'm going to finish with Jane Goodall because I think she's one of my favorites. It was my last interview, and it was one of her last interviews. Let me say a word about Francis Collins. Do any of you know him? Do you know that? Oh, gosh. Go buy his books. Don't buy this. Do buy this. But his stuff is so good. And the language of God, he grew up in an atheist home. And he said it wasn't a loving home. His parents were very artistic, musicians. And I grew up in a great home, but we just didn't have any need for all that myth. And he said, then I felt called into science. I felt called into medical school, or not called. I wanted to be a doctor. And he said, so he ends up at Chapel Hill Medical School in North Carolina. And he said, you know how we do in Texas and the Bible Belt. And he said, I kept running these people to talk about Jesus and their prayer life and church. And I would think in my head, well, that's nice for you if you believe. If that helps you, good for you. And he said, then one day he was talking with this patient, an elderly woman, he said, who I'd grown very warm to. She had almost died and had recovered, and she was telling me how her prayer life helped her and how her faith helped her. And again, he said, I was thinking, nice for you, and I listened patiently, and she got through, and she stopped, and she looked at me and said, Dr. Collins, what do you believe? And he said, I suddenly realized I was on thin ice. He said, I am a scientist. I'm a medical doctor. And I had not taken the time to consider the empirical evidence that there might be a God. And he said, her question set me on a path of thinking and reflecting and reading, and kind of like C.S. Lewis, if you know C.S. Lewis's story, it took years. And he said, I got to the point of, okay, there's a God, I'll give you that. But if God is who God, I think God is, holy and pure goodness and all those things, then I'm none of those things. And he said, and so I said, well, what bridged that gap for you? And he said, and that's when I met Jesus, who bridged that gap for me. And he said, and I didn't come to faith in a church service or a crusade. He was out on a hike in New England and crossed a hill and saw a frozen waterfall, and he said, okay, I'm in. And that was kind of it. But it's a remarkable story. And go to YouTube, Francis Collins. He's brilliant, head of the Human DNA Genome Project, which made me feel tremendously insufficient to even talk to him. But he shows a cross section of a DNA strand and the rose window in Westminster Abbey, and he puts them next to each other. And he says, a lot of people say these two worlds can't coexist, but I think they absolutely do, and let me tell you why. And so I'll leave it. There's a cliffhanger for you. Amy Grant has become a friend. She's a singer-songwriter. You know Amy Grant from her stuff all the way back into the 70s up till now, and she transitioned into secular music. But she came and did a few concerts for us at St. Martin's over the years, and And so I went to see her at her home in Nashville, and but this is not too long after she had had a pretty devastating bike accident a few summers ago. And she was honest enough well, let me begin by saying this. We're sitting, for a woman who's married to Vince Gill and the success they've had together, it's a fairly modest home, to be honest, for who they are, especially when you drive around parts of Austin or Houston or Dallas. But it's right on the road. Anybody could drive up like stalkers. But we're sitting there, and I said, tell me a little bit about your devotional life. And she said, well, I lost some memory after that bike accident. And she said, because I said, you do have a favorite scripture? She said, well, I find it better if I sing the scriptures now. I can remember them more easily. And then she said, can I sing for you? And it's just the two of us. And I said, well, yeah, is there a charge? And so she said, okay. And she sang the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And got to the end, and we were both I was in tears. And she said, right before that bike accident, I was at the top of this hill with my friend, and I'll be honest, my life at that point was not exactly where it should have been. There were some things out of order, and it was getting overwhelming, and I just needed something. And she said, then we headed down the hill. I had a pothole, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the emergency room. And my friend, she said, I don't remember this, but my friend said, one of the first things I said to her was, I needed this. And she said, what I found was that God's office is often at the end of your rope. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that the world needs to hear. And so I said, well, then, Amy, what do you say to people who look at you and Vince and say you've got money and fame and influence and all that? And she said, I'm not going to lie and say, I'm not grateful that I can put a roof over our heads and we can take care of our children. And yes, we can travel. And we can all these people, by the way, are committed to things outside of themselves. All of them support some sort of nonprofit or ministry around the world. And so I will say, I promised them that I would tithe from what I got on this, and it goes to their 12 things that they've chosen. So you look in the back, if you buy a book, you're supporting all 12 of those things. But she said, all those things are mean about as much as the dopamine hit you get from a thumbs up on your Facebook page. And they last about that long. And I said, did you just come up with that? She said, yeah. I said, well, that's in the book. That's a good quote. Let me end with two. I'm going to say a word about Nikki Haley, because I think she's an honorable, I'm not talking politics, just as a person. And one of the moments that really struck me about her is what she did after the shooting at Emmanuel Church, AME Church in Charleston. The way she handled that, the way she led her state, the way it became an example for, I think, all of our country. But she grew up Sikh. Their family was Sikh. They were Indian. And she grew up in Bamberg, South Carolina. And as she put it, there are 1,800 people in Bamberg, South Carolina. We were the only dark-skinned people in all of Bamberg, South Carolina. So they knew we were different. And she said, one day, South Carolina, right? Texas, Alabama, there's a knock at the door, and one of her sisters, not Nikki, one of her sister's friends is standing at the door, a little boy, and he's holding a Bible. She opens the door, he's holding the Bible. And he hands it to her, and he starts crying and goes, please read this. We don't want you all to go to hell. And I thought, that's not the best evangelism method to file away. But her sister took the Bible and stuck it under her pillow and was kind of afraid what mom and dad might say. And her mom came in, and again, this is Nikki's sister, takes the Bible out, finds it, takes the Bible out, and holds it up in front of her sister and says, I want you to read every word of this because there's truth in here. And she said that openness allowed me to grow and eventually become a Christian and eventually become a Methodist. But then she went on to say, wouldn't it be great if we were all so generous in the way we understood one another? And so I said, tell me about how and I said, feel free to pass. You may not want to talk about the shooting, but if you all remember that shooting, Dylan Roof comes into a Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church and sits with them for an hour. Imagine something like this, right? Something like this. And then he gets up and pulls out a gun and kills 9 people. And I said, how did you kind of got us all through that. And she said, as soon as it happened, I knew I had a leadership role. I'm paraphrasing, and this is in the book. But she said, I committed to go to all 9 of those funerals, of course. And she said, what I didn't know is that all 9 would be open casket. And I did not know that the pastor was going to ask me to speak at all 9. She said, so it began, and I'm speaking. And as we're going through this, she said, I began to lose weight. I lost 35 pounds. I began to lose sleep. I began to get anxious, and the scenes and the whole moment just haunted me. And I did all the things you're supposed to do. I went to see my pastor. I said my prayers. I went to church. I went to a therapist. I got medication for help. I was doing all but none of it was really helping and she said, and then I came home one night, and she stopped, and she started crying. And she put her hands over her eyes like this. And she said, I'm sorry. And she said, it's just still so raw and so real. But I came in, I closed my door, I fell down on my knees, and I said, God, please help me. And he did. And I was able to do the rest of the work involved in that. And my health was restored. All right, let's finish with Jane Goodall. I'm assuming most everybody knows Jane Goodall. You think of Jane Goodall, you think of chimpanzees. She has a great sense of humor, and I only knew her from being a child and studying her in school and stuff. But my wife is very tuned into the environment, and she's a botanical artist, and she loves gardens, and she's very organic and all the things. And I'm somewhat, but my wife really is. And so she likes, when she works with plant material, she likes to listen to books. So she listened to Jane's book, wonderful book, A Reason for Hope. I commend that book to you. And she said, now we're going to listen to this book together. And we were going on a long road trip. So she puts it in, however you do that. She's the one who knows how to do that. And we're listening, and Jane starts talking about her faith and Bible verses and growing up in the Anglican Church. And she said, I went to church a lot, and I had a very real, powerful, personal experience with Jesus. And then she said, and I used to go to church a lot because my vicar was very handsome. And when I was a teenager, I found reasons to go by his house and knock on the door and ask deep theological questions. She said, but something was going on in all that. And now I will say Jane's faith, and you'll see all these people come to God in different ways. And her faith's very wide, and a lot of her, she died an Anglican, but her faith is wide, and a lot of what she experiences with God and around God is in the world that God created for us, which is why she works so tirelessly to protect it. So we're in the car driving, and I'm hearing all this, and I look at my wife, and I said, she's a believer. My wife, Laura, goes, yeah, that's why she needs to be in the book. So I said, okay, well, I'll start my stalking. And so she eventually said yes. And that one had to be on Zoom because Jane, up until her death, was speaking 300 days a year at the age of 90. And at the time, she was in North Dakota, in a little cabin. I don't even know how she got her computer to work, tracking the migration of the cranes. She wanted to be with the migration of the cranes. And so, when she spoke to crowds, particularly college crowds, thousands would show up. And she could electrify. I will tell you, I'm not endorsing, but she used to say, just so you know, she said, I did have a little, she called it a dram, we would call it a shot, of Jack Daniels before I talked. And so, up until her last talk. And so, but it just helped a little bit. I did not have one before I came to talk to you. But so in the last few years, she started telling this story that at one of these gatherings, one of these bright-eyed co-eds, raised her hand, and she had a Q&A time, and yes, she said, and this young man or young woman says, Dr. Goodall, you've had these incredible adventures. What's your next great adventure? And Jane stops, and she goes, death. And kind of quiet, she goes, if you believe in life after death, and she said, which I do, can you imagine what God has in store for us after this? I just get chills still when I tell it. And so when I wrote her, I said, I put Francis Collins at the beginning. Everybody else is random because of his coming to faith through creation. And I put her at the end because of that question. So we get to the end of her interview, and I said, Dr. Goodall, and she goes, Jane. And I said, can't do that. And she goes, Dr. Jane. And I said, okay, all right, Dr. Jane, you know what I'm going to ask? She says, I know what you're going to ask because that's why you asked me to be in the book. So I said, well, say it again. What's your next great adventure? And she says, at the end of the book, she says, death, because life is yet to come, and the greatest adventure is yet to come. So she also had this belief, and I share it, that there are no coincidences. So I'm going to close with this story because this happened after all of this. So the book's out, and we do all the things that John and I have done when you get in that final stages of finishing up, and the book's about to be released. And so October 1st was the first event for this book, and it was a diocesan retreat for Daughters of the King, and they were going to have early copies there. And so like there is here, there's a table outside to sign books and all that stuff. And so I'm ending as I am right now, on Dr. Goodall, and I'm excited, and I said, she's 91 years old. She's in California today. She's leaving here because I talked to her assistant that morning at 10:48. I only know because of the way this story goes. And her assistant said, you know, the book's coming out next week. We'd love to put something up on the website to kind of, because part of this goes to the Jane Goodall Institute, for the record. And I said, yeah, I can get you some stuff, but right now I'm going to this thing, and we'll get it later today. So I'm going on and on about Jane. She's going to actually leaving here. She's going to D.C. to meet with lawmakers. She's going to New York. Then she's going back to England. She's going back to Africa. And somebody raised their hand, and I said, is she not 90? Did I get that wrong? Was it her birthday? She's 92. And somebody said, this was about 1:40, and somebody p.m. Somebody said, no, she just died, as I was talking about her. Well, because my wife has this passion for her, my wife's in the back at this thing, and so I immediately connect with my bride, and I tear up, and I'm kind of like stunned and step back for a minute and just held on for a minute. And so that ended in a way that this won't end, and I just said, well, we've got to pray now. And we quietly prayed, and so they had a little business to do before we finished up, and so I said a closing prayer, and then I thanked people, and I left. And I immediately went to the back to hunt down Laura, and we gave each other a big hug and kind of teared up. And we went and sat down outside at the book table, which is what we do. And I looked at Laura, and I said, I just can't believe she's dead. I mean, we were just talking to her assistant this morning, emailing with her assistant this morning. And at that moment, this giant rush of wind just kind of moves right over us. And I teared up again. In each chapter of the book, I let each person choose their own picture. So here's Jane's picture that she chose of herself. And then I plucked out one quote from each interview. And Jane's quote was, did God exist? Of course. God was as real to me as the wind that rustled through our garden. And I opened it up and I said, you remember this? And then I turned it around, I said it in front of everybody who came by. And not too long before she died, she wrote us this sweet note. She said, dear Russ and Laura, I'm sorry we didn't get to spend more time together, and I feel that way too. And she said, but there's one thing we can do. We can pray to the great spiritual force of the universe. And then she said, which you and I know to be God. And I agree with her. So the deep need of our world right now is that we have more witnesses. Here are 12 that hopefully will inspire you. The hope for me is that believers and followers will read it and go, okay, here are different ways to pray, or here's different ways to serve. But that non-believers might walk by and go, there's Denzel Washington, what's he do? Why is he on the cover of a book called Witness to Belief? Or why is that guy on Law and Order? Why is Lieutenant Dan from, Forrest Gump on, and then they might go, wow, I know there's something to this. Let me close with this picture for you. This is, how many of you have been to Death Valley? Have you been? So you know what it looks like, right? So I have not, so I got a picture. But this is Death Valley, and it's the most arid place probably in the U.S. for most of the time. People still go there for that reason. But in 2016, something remarkable happened that doesn't happen but every dozen or so years, if. So this is Death Valley, but right below all these cracks and desert places, there are actually seeds that have not come to life. And in 2016, there was a very short rainstorm. And it landed on this area just enough to awaken and germinate all those seeds and create what's called a super bloom. Doesn't happen very often, but imagine our world like this, and there are seeds all around you here in Austin and Round Rock and all the surrounding areas, just waiting for a little bit of what you and I know God offers through his Son and the love of Christ. And if we can just do that little bit, think of the super bloom you would create in this place. Well, John promised I'd be quiet 15 minutes ago, and so I'm going to be quiet. I am happy to stay and answer questions, but I want you to go to dinner, and I want you to consider picking up some of this, sharing the news of it, and let me pray, and then you can go, okay? Thank you for this wonderful visit with you. Let's pray. Thank you. Very sweet. Thank you. Lord, thank you so much for your love and grace. Again, as I said moments ago, that surrounds us on every side. Help us to remember that. Help us to know that we're not alone and that you do love us and that you do want to be walking with us, not just every now and then, not just during the season of Lent, but day by day, and that we would find our meaning and purpose and really the peace that we all seek by giving ourselves more and more over to what you already offer us. Lord, bless this church, bless its leadership, and bless us all in this season of Lent as we reflect and pray and grow. May we come through our Good Fridays to that great Easter Sunday and know that we will be with you not just for this part of life, but forever. These things I offer in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you. I'll stick around if you want to chat.
Russ, I can't thank you enough for letting us witness your belief and faith tonight. Thank you for sharing with us. Let's have another round of applause for Russ Levenson. Yeah.